Hey folks, in this video we're going to be talking about the principle of two weaknesses. Now this might be a concept that you may have heard elsewhere, but it's a really important one that a lot of strong players are often relying on when trying to convert an advantageous position. So the main thing to understand is that in general, one weak square or one weak pawn in the opponent's position might not be enough to actually net you the full point. And if you want to give your pieces the best chance of breaking through and actually converting the advantage, then you may want to create a second or even third weakness in the opponent's position. The more threats and problems you can create for the opponent, the more you can stretch their defenses, the more likely you are of breaking through and actually winning the game. So we're going to take a look at a couple of practical examples of this concept in action, starting with a pretty classic game between Akiba Rubinstein and Geza Marazzi. Now Akiba is one of the great technical players of all time. I think he's a player definitely worth studying further if you want to check out some of his games. They are very, very instructive, and a lot of top players note Rubinstein as being one of the great endgame players of the past. So in this position, Rubinstein is in full control with his rooks doubled up on the d file. And we might consider this a 6-pawn, a weakness in black's position. This is a weak pawn that needs defending, but I would also say that the back rank is a potential problem for black as well. And so a weakness doesn't always have to be a weak pawn or a weak square. It can be something like the back rank or the fact that you have a powerful passed pawn. That can definitely be a weakness for your opponent. But currently white didn't really have enough to break through here. If he tries to move rook to d8, black would probably respond rook c8, covering the back rank. And now white actually has to be careful here, because if we try a move like rook 1 to d7, for example, well, we have our own back rank to worry about. Or if we played this rook back to d7, black could either block on the 7th rank with rook c7, or even play the cold shower tactic, queen takes d7, after which it turns out that white would be losing due to our own weak back rank. So instead of rushing forward with the attack, instead Rubinstein plays a very powerful move here, h4. Not only creating luft for the king and stopping all of these ideas, but also launching the pawn forward to h5, where it's going to target black's knight, and then one day even to h6, where it's going to create weaknesses around black's king. Now in the game, black played f6, preparing for the advance of h5 and defending the e5 pawn. But it wasn't really possible for black to stop this advance. If h5, then white could just play the simple move here, queen f5, and grab this pawn next. So this would be kind of unacceptable. And if black had played h6, well, now white can play rook to d8 without worrying about his own back rank. For example, rook c8, white can come in with rook to d7, queen b6, queen d5, taking aim at this f7 pawn and putting black under massive pressure. Now in the game, black goes f6. But now after queen d5 check, king h8, h5, knight f8, h6, very powerful move. All of a sudden, black structure here is falling apart and white is simply breaking through. And black has a very difficult dilemma here because the g7 pawn is under attack, but if the pawn moves at any point, well, white will simply be able to take on f6. So the game here continued knight to g6. White plays queen e6. Now the tactics start coming. Very, very strong shot here. If rook takes e6, there's going to be rook to d8 with a back rank mate. Black tried to get out of the way with rook to f8. Rook d7. Now white goes after the 7th rank. If takes, then the g7 pawn will fall next, and that's going to be mate. So black took on h6 here, and now a very, very nice finish by Rubinstein, who was often tactically alert. Bishop h4. A powerful shot hitting and going after this f6 pawn, which is a huge target, with the point being that if black plays knight takes h4, white follows up with the cool move queen to e7, threatening multiple checkmates in the position, and black simply has no defense to all the threats. If rook takes d7, white is simply taking on f8. So that was the end of the game, a really, really powerful demonstration of just how quickly black's position fell apart after white launched this h-pawn forward to target this knight on g6. And I should say that this is a pretty typical idea whenever you're dealing with an enemy knight on this square, on g6 square or on b6, using your rook pawn to harass the knight. Or if there is a pawn here, fianchettoed, playing h4 and h5 is a very, very typical way of going after your opponent's position and trying to create new weaknesses in their camp. Our next example here features the great world champion Mikhail Botvinnik taking on another world champion, Alexander Alekhine. Botvinnik, like Rubinstein, was another fantastic technical player with many really instructive endgames, and one of the few players that would really encourage you guys to study further, taking a look at his games and trying to learn from them. In this position, playing white, Botvinnik is clearly better and was trying to convert his advantage. He has this rook very nicely placed on c7, and black's knight on b8 is quite passive. That said, although black's queenside pawns are currently weak, it's not so easy for white to actually capitalize and break through here. In case of a move like rook to b7, not only could black just play b5 here and defend the pawn, but it would be even stronger to throw in rook to c8 first, getting some counterplay due to this threat of rook to c1 check that white would have to deal with, and then playing b5 next after black has already seized the open file. So not wanting to lose his advantage here, Botvinnik plays, I think, a very accurate and very precise game, starting with the move king to f1. So here black goes rook to f7, a very logical move challenging the rook on the 7th rank. Rook c8 check, rook f8. And now comes a key decision, what to do for white. We can't stay on the 7th rank, black will simply repeat moves and ask for a draw. And if we trade rooks here, well then after king takes f8, all of a sudden it's not clear why white should have any advantage whatsoever. Black's knight is going to easily come out to c6, the king is going to come to the center, and it doesn't seem like white has any reason to be better here. So Botvinnik makes a very patient, very mature decision. He simply retreats rook to c3. And this is the type of move that a lot of players might not feel comfortable making because it seems like we're losing our advantage. But in fact, white is keeping the rooks on the board, keeping the threat of activating the rook alive, and things are still not easy for black here. For example, if black tries to develop with knight to d7, well now white can simply return rook to c7, and this knight doesn't really have any good squares. Sure, black could play rook to d8, but then black's position would be really passive, and well, white can continue bringing in the king, king e2, king d3, and eventually going after black's queenside pawns. Not to mention the knight can be maneuvered. For example, knight e1, knight d3, knight f4, or knight to b4, going after black's pawns as well. So by keeping the rooks on the board, Botvinnik keeps all of his pressure and play in the position and makes things really difficult for black. So the game continued g5. Black tries to advance some pawns and get some space for the king. Knight to e1, the knight starts transferring over to d3 where it can poke and put some pressure on black's queenside. h5, and now an absolutely fantastic move here, h4. One of the most instructive moves I've honestly ever seen. I remember going through this game as a much younger player, and I was really impressed with the power of this move. So black's pawn on g5 is put under pressure. White threatens to at some point take and maybe play knight f3. If black takes on h4, then white can simply play knight to d3 here, followed by knight f4, and black's pawns here will be so weak that the extra pawn will never be worth anything, and at any point white can simply start picking up the weak pawns. If black plays g4, well then white is able to again create this f4 square for the knight, and the knight on f4 is simply brilliant, attacking almost every weak pawn in black's position. So a really difficult choice for black. He plays knight to d7 here. Now white comes back with rook to c7, rook f7 is played, and knight f3. Very nice move. It seems like white is wasting time. He's returning his knight to f3, but in fact he's attacking the g5 pawn, putting a little bit more pressure here and inducing black to push g4, giving up the f4 square. Because black can't defend with rook to g7 here white would take on g5 and then take again, taking advantage of the fact that the knight on d7 is hanging. Black's rook is overloaded, defending too many things. After rook takes g5, rook takes d7, white would have an extra pawn in this rook endgame with a pretty sizable advantage, as the rook is still very active and can continue going after black's pawns. So after knight to f3 here, Alekhine pushes g4, but now white gets exactly what he wants. He comes back, knight to e1. The knight is again headed for d3 and f4. Now that he's induced further weaknesses with g4 here, the knight comes to f4, and white is going to be able to capitalize on all of black's weaknesses. f5 is played, knight d3, f4. Black is trying to do whatever he can to stop white from getting active. And now white could somehow win a pawn here with knight takes f4, but actually this would not be so clear. After rook takes f4, rook takes d7, black would take on d4 at the end, gaining the pawn back. And since black's rook here is also quite active, the rook can drop down to d2 or go over to b4. I don't think white would have quite the edge he's looking for. So Botvinnik doesn't cash in, instead plays again another very patient move, f3, simply fixing the pawn on f4. Now this pawn is going to be a long-term weakness, and the position is getting more and more difficult for black. G takes f3 is played. Black could have also played a move like g3, then white could play rook c6, for example, sliding the rook over to d6, and black would simply have too many weaknesses in the position to hold on. And we can really see the power of the principle of two weaknesses at play here. When we started this example, white had one active rook and not really enough to go off of to win the game, but now black has so many weak pawns and so many issues that white is able to put a lot of pressure and threaten to win the game simply by collecting all of these weak pawns. So g takes f3, g takes f3, a5, white pushes a4, fixing the b6 pawn as yet another weakness, and now black's position is really critical. The game continued king f8, rook c6, king e7. Now white simply starts bringing in the king, rook to f5, b3. Super patient play here by Botvinnik. He's in total control. None of black's pieces can possibly activate themselves, and he's just enjoying this position and taking his time converting. King d8 played, king e2, knight b8, and now this actually sets a kind of a nice trap. If white takes on b6 here, seemingly winning a pawn, black would play king to c7 followed by knight to c6, and all of a sudden the d4 pawn would be quite weak. And just like that, the position can turn and black can go from a very passive position to a position with fighting chances. So it's very important to stay alert and stay accurate. Instead of grabbing the pawn, white simply keeps the rook active. King c7 is played, and now a very important move, knight to e5, stopping black from activating his own knight on c6 and keeping total control, total domination over the position. So the game didn't last much longer. Black continued knight a6, and white continued improving the position. Now the knight comes into c6 with a deadly threat of knight e7 check, winning either the rook or the pawn on d5. Black was forced to back up, and white finally collects on his huge positional advantage here. Takes on d5. All of black's pawns in the position still very, very weak, and black is not able to create any kind of meaningful counterplay here. The game finished knight b4. White takes and goes for a pretty comfortable rook endgame here. Rook takes d4 was possible, but then white would play rook to b5. Black has to defend this pawn, and then after h5, it's kind of a hopeless rook endgame as this h pawn is going to be really strong, and of course, black's remaining pawns are still super weak. So instead, rook c6 was played, just hoping to activate the rook, but Botvinnik is super careful until the end. Takes on b4, rook h6, rook b5, takes, king to d3, and now 2 pawns down, black decided to resign here as white's king is coming into e4. All of white's pawns are easily defended here. Black is probably going to lose the f4 pawn at some point, and white, of course, already has a pass pawn and can create another one very easily. So totally hopeless situation here for black. So a really instructive example by Botvinnik here. Instead of trading the rooks and losing his advantage, he simply keeps the rook on the board, makes one patient move, and black was not able to solve all of his problems from here as the pawn on d5 remained a constant weakness. Black always had to watch out for any kind of rook slides over to the queen side and target the queenside pawns. And after g5, knight e1, h5, and h4, white was able to create further weaknesses in the position, which allowed his rook and his knight to simply come in and clean up all of black's weaknesses. Our final example features David Bronstein trying to convert this advantageous endgame where he has the superior pair rook and bishop against rook and knight. So here Bronstein does very interesting. He plays the move rook to d5, offering a rook trade and offering black the chance to go into this bishop versus knight endgame. Now black really should have declined this offer and played something like rook e7 check. White would move the king, black can go rook e6, white can follow up bishop b5, and white would undoubtedly be better here. The bishop is a stronger piece than the knight, and white's king is a little bit more centrally placed, but I think black would have more drawing chances here than in the game. But let's take a look at what happened. So black decides to trade on d5 white goes bishop takes d5. And I think this is a really great example of why the bishop is going to be dominating the knight in many of these endgames. It's considered kind of a general rule when you have pawns on both sides of the board that the bishop is going to outplay the knight. And the simple reason here is that the bishop can attack both sections of the board, in fact all portions of the board. It's a very long range piece, while the knight has to kind of choose whether it wants to play in the center or on the king side or on the queen side. So the game continued knight to e5. White now plays king to e3, and the idea is to bring the king into the center as quickly as possible. In fact, if black were to play the move knight g4 check, which looks like it attacks the king and the pawn, white would simply leave this pawn behind and play the move king to d4. And this is, I think, a cool variation that kind of demonstrates the power of the bishop over the knight. Let's say black takes on f2, white would play king to c4 here, and this is basically a very powerful pawn sacrifice based on white trying to get to black's queenside pawns very, very quickly, and then relying on the power of the queenside passers. So, for example, a sample line here could go knight to d1, bishop comes back, knight e3, king goes forward, knight f5. Let's say black tries to go for the rest of the kingside pawns. And just to demonstrate how this might play out, I'll just play a couple moves here. King to b6, takes on h4, bishop goes to b7, and here we can already see the picture. The bishop is not only supporting our a pawn, but is also going to be playing defense. And regardless of who wins the race here, f3, a7, f2. Here white wins because we promote with check, but even if we didn't have this resource, after a simple move bishop to a6, we can see exactly the problem that the knight has over the bishop. The knight has no way of dealing with the passed a pawn, whereas the bishop can simply stop the enemy passed pawn in its tracks and leave the a pawn free to win the game. So instead of going for these lines where white's king simply ends up too active, black decides to play king to e7. And now Bronstein plays king to d4, which is actually slightly inaccurate here. The point is that black could have taken this chance to now play the move knight to g4. And the idea here is that if white plays king to c4, heading to b5, black would have the nice move king to d6. Hitting the bishop and taking advantage of the fact that bishop takes f7 would run into knight e5 check, losing the bishop. So in view of this resource, the situation would not be as clear here. Instead, after knight g4, white should either start with f3, where black will go knight h6 and white will keep an advantage, or try the very tricky king c3, where after knight takes f2, king to c4, white triangulates in a funny way, where now that black has taken on f2, white still wants to play king to b5 and go after black's queenside pawns, but here if black plays king to d6, white will be able to take on f7 and keep these pawns in the bishop's sights. So this was a chance missed by black. I think black would have had decent chances to hold there, although white remains clearly better. Instead, black played the move f6, which makes a lot of sense as the pawn is no longer under attack. But now after f4, knight d7, and king c4, white really starts to grind the position. King d6 is played, bishop f7 going after these pawns. Knight f8, the knight is forced into passivity. And now after king b5, king to c7, we kind of have the picture that white is aiming for here. The bishop is putting pressure on the king side, the king is putting pressure on the queen side. All that's left to win the game is to find some kind of way of either improving the position or a chance of putting black into a zugzwang. And this is exactly what Bronstein finds with this move bishop to e8. A very powerful waiting move, keeping the g-pawn under attack, so of course the knight on f8 cannot really move, and now black has a very difficult decision. In the game, black played king to b7, and we'll kind of see what happens there. Black could have also played a move like f5, hoping to simply wait it out, but then white would come in with king to a6, and black would very quickly run out of moves here. In fact, right away, the only move is to play king to d8, hitting the bishop. Then after something like bishop f7, king comes back, king a7. Black's king here is simply going to run out of moves as the knight can't move at all, and white's bishop can just shuffle as much as it wants. So king c6, for example, king to b8, and if the king continues to move up, white will play king to c7, and the king can go to b4, but the pawn is defended thanks to the bishop. White simply takes on b6 and wins the game, or can also go after the knight with a plan like king d6, king e7. So not wanting to let white's king into a6, black instead plays the move king to b7 here. But now Bronstein demonstrates the beautiful principle of two weaknesses. with a very instructive follow of king to c4, now transferring the king over to the king side and making it very difficult for black to defend. The king activates with king to d5. All of a sudden, black is another zugzwang. If the king moves out of the way, white's king is advancing into d6 and e7. And if f5, then of course king e5 and heading in this way. So black tried king to d8, and now really accurate finish here from Bronstein. He first plays bishop c6, black comes back king to c7, and now goes bishop to b5. And black here is in total zugzwang. Now he has to let the king in to one of these two squares. Knight h7 was played, king e6, g5, hoping to trade some pawns and break out, but the knight is simply too loose here and too passive, and after king f7, takes, f5, king g7, the knight was trapped and the game was over. So a really instructive example showing not only the power that the bishop has over the knight, these kinds of endgames with pawns on opposite sides over the board, but also the power of the principle of two weaknesses. When your opponent has multiple weaknesses on both sides of the board, it's very important to look for opportunities to switch back and forth from attacking one flank to attacking the other. And if you can fully stretch their defenses, well then this will be your best chance of breaking through. All right guys, that's going to wrap it up for this video. Hope you found it instructive, and I'll catch you in the next one. Take care.